Okay, Masechet Dmai Parak Gimel Mishnah Aleph. Machilin Esaniyim Dmai Vesachsanya Dmai. Since most Amei Haaretz do take off Meiser, the Chachamim allowed a number of kulas in regard to Dmai. Many of these kulas were mentioned previously in Parak Aleph. This parak begins with a discussion of a kula of Dmai relating to people who are in need. And the halacha is that we may feed poor people Dmai. Poor people who beg at the door may be given a meal of Dmai, which they may eat without taking off Meiser. There's going to be maybe a difference with food that's distributed by tzedakah people. There's no difference whether the poor are chaverim, whether they keep the laws of Dmai, or Amei Haaretz who do not. Even chaverim who do not take off meiser even chaverim do not need to take meiser off the food they receive. However, they may wish to be machmir and take off meiser. Vesach sanya Dmai, we may feed traveling soldiers Dmai. In those times, townspeople were responsible for feeding Jewish soldiers passing through the town. This would only apply if the soldiers do not stay overnight. If they do stay overnight, they're viewed as living temporarily in the town rather than merely passing through, and the food that they eat is going to be mechuyev in the Dmai. So the Chachamim were mekel regarding feeding poor people and traveling soldiers, since these are charity-related acts. Nevertheless, if someone feeds Dmai to a poor person or a traveling soldier, he must let him know in advance that the food is Dmai, so that if he wishes to be strict and not take advantage of the kula that allows him to eat Dmai, he may do so, and obviously it's not an issue. Rabbi Gamliel hoyamachel as poil of Dmai. Rabbi Gamliel goes weiter and he says that he would feed his poor workers Dmai. Rabbi Gamliel holds that since the workers are poor and may eat Dmai, since that they can eat Dmai, you're allowed to feed them Dmai as well. The custom where Rabbi Gamliel lived was for those who hired workers to supply their workers with meals. Now their custom actually obligates the employer to supply meals, like the Gemara says at the beginning of Masechet HaPoelim. Nevertheless, Rabbi Gamliel holds that since the workers are poor and may eat Dmai, it's mutter to feed them Dmai lechatchila. It may be that Rabbi Gamliel allowed paying an obligation to the worker with Dmai only when paying workers, so that the work should be more easily available for the poor, and not when paying other chiyuvim. According to the Tanna Kama, however, feeding Dmai to one's workers is asur, since it's considered paying one's obligations with Dmai, which is asur regardless. Gabet tzedakah. The Mishnah's kula that permits poor people to eat Dmai applies only to small amounts of food, such as a single meal given to the poor people who beg at the door. But a person who gives out, distributes tzedakah, who provides poor people with larger amounts of food, so the Chachamim in this case do not pater such a person from Dmai. And so because of this, the Mishnah will discuss how these people who distribute tzedakah can distribute Dmai. So Gabet tzedakah regarding people who collect tzedakah, who collect food from the townspeople and distribute it to the poor. So Beis Shammai say, they give the food that Meiser was already taken from the people who are trusted already to a person who does not separate Meisers. Since we cannot rely on Amei Haaretz to separate Meisers, so Beis Shammai require that the Gabet tzedakah give them only food that has already been taken off Meiser from. And Dmai should be given to a person who does take off Meiser, because those who receive Dmai are given extra food to make up for the Meiser that they will separate. So Nimtu Kol Adam Oichel Mesukin. So as a result, each person who receives from Tzedakah will eat food that Meiser was already taken off. So by giving the Dmai to those who can be trusted to take off Meiser, and by giving Amei Haaretz food that was only Meiser, you only give them food that was Meiser previously, so the Gabet tzedakah ensure that no one eats forbidden food. So according to Beis Shammai, in order to ensure that the Amei Haaretz do not receive Dmai, the Gabet tzedakah must keep the donations they receive from Amei Haaretz separate from those received from people who are trusted to take off Meiser. The Chachamim say, Goyven stam u'mechalken stam v'roitzel l'saken yisaken. The Gabet tzedakah collect the food without differentiating, without keeping two separate collections for those who take off Meiser and for those who don't. And they distribute the food to all the poor people in the town without any differentiation in the distribution either, between the Amei Haaretz and those who are Neman. V'roitzel l'saken yisaken, and the poor person who's willing to take off Meiser will take off Meiser, and that means that he's mechuyev to take off Meiser. Nevertheless, the Chachamim were being saimech on the poor people to take Meiser off their own food. When the Mishnah says, literally, he who wishes to take off Meiser will take off Meiser, it doesn't mean that it's up to the poor person to decide whether or not to take off Meiser. Rather, the poor person is mechuyev to take off Meiser from the food that was given to him. What the Mishnah means is that the Chachamim left the Chi of Meiser in the poor person's hands knowing quite well that there will be Amei Haaretz who do not take Meiser off their food. So according to the Chachamim, the Gabbai Tzedakah don't separate the food that they collected from the Amei Haaretz, because there's a concern that the Amei Haaretz who sees his contribution being kept separately will become upset and not give tzedakah anymore at all. Therefore, since the Dmai and the Meiser are both being collected the same way and being kept together in the same place, it's not possible to differentiate between what's given to Chaverim and what's given to the Amei Haaretz. Therefore, we have no choice but to rely on the poor people to take Meiser off their own food. In the first case of the Mishnah, however, there's no chiyuv to take Meiser off the produce, it's just a chumrah to do it like that. That is because this case is speaking about a single meal given to the poor people who come knocking on the doors. So such meals are not mechuyev in the Dmai at all. Masha Enkein Gabbai Tzedakah, however, provide poor people with larger amounts of food, and the Chachamim did not exempt such donations from the chiyuv of the Dmai. Mishnah Beis. Hareita lachzem ala yarok lahakal mimasoi layashlach ad she'aser. So there's going to be a number of this. The Mishnah is going to discuss a number of situations where a person may take care that Tevel and Dmai don't come into the hands of Amei Haaretz, that Amei Haaretz shouldn't be nichshel in eating Dmai. We have to go out of our way to make sure that they aren't nichshel in Dmai. So a person who's carrying a load of vegetables that are Tevel or Dmai and wishes to trim the edible leaves off the vegetables to lighten his burden, he may not discard the trimmed leaves by the roadside until he first takes Meiser off of it, because the discarded leaves may be found by an Amei Haaretz who may eat them without separating Meisers. The Mishnah is saying that to any produce that a person, the Mishnah is talking about any produce that a person would throw away. It mentions vegetable leaves to teach that even vegetable leaves, which are very insignificant and most likely nobody will claim them, Afal Pikan, you must still take Meiser off of it, since it's possible that someone will come and take them. We have seen in the first Mishnah of the Masechta that anything that's hefker is not mechuyev in Meiser. However, that's only true when the produce becomes hefker before the produce was processed, which when there was a chiyuv Meiser. But for vegetables that are packed into bundles, the chiyuv Meiser takes effect when they're packed into the bundles. So this Mishnah, which requires the vegetables to be Meisered, must be referring to vegetables that were packed into bundles, as we mentioned in Parak Aleph of Masechta Peah. Halakech yarok min hashuk, v'nimlach lahachzer layachzer ad sheyaser. Lahalacha, a sale is considered final when the buyer performs a kinyan, which is an act of taking ownership with the intention of taking ownership of the merchandise. Movable items, metaltalin, can be acquired through a kinyan of hadbo, which means lifting, or meshicha, which would mean pulling, depending on the item being acquired, like the Mishnah discusses in Kedushin in Parak Aleph. Once a kinyan is performed, the buyer owns the merchandise, even if the money has not yet been paid, as long as the price per unit that's being bought is known. Therefore, once a kinyan has been performed, returning the purchased merchandise to the seller is the same as buying it back, as selling it back to him. So the Mishnah is going to say two halachas concerning a buyer who wishes to return produce that he purchased. So if a person is buying bundles of vegetables there's a set price per bundle from an Amei Haaretz, so in the marketplace, and the buyer picks up a number of bundles intending to take them home and own them, before he counted them to determine the total price before he pays for it, he changes his mind and decides to return them to the storekeeper. The halacha is that he may not return these vegetables to the owner until he takes off Meiser. Since the buyer has already lifted the vegetables with the intention of being kind to them, they are now his. So when he returns the vegetables to the seller, to the Meicher, he's in effect selling them back to the Meicher. Since it's usher to sell the Dmai to an Amei Haaretz, he must take off Meiser from the vegetables before returning to them. Why? She'ena mechusar el minyan. The reason why the sale is complete at this point, because there's a set price per bundle, and all that is needed to be known is the number of bundles that he selected. As long as the only information needed is the count of the bundles, the sale is complete as soon as the buyer lifts them. But what if the buyer did not pick up the vegetables? If while he was still in the midst of purchasing a bundle of vegetables, meaning the seller was setting aside vegetables for the buyer to purchase, and the buyer did not yet lift up the merchandise, so and he saw another load of vegetables which was better quality than the first, and decided to buy the second load of bundles of a second bundle or bunch of vegetables that he saw instead. He's permitted to return the first ones without taking off meiser because he didn't do mashicha. In this case, it wouldn't be mashicha; it would probably be hagba, which is the appropriate kinyan for vegetables. The Mishnah commonly uses the term Mashicha when referring to either Mashicha or hagba. They always go together. So therefore, the buyer never owned them, and therefore, by returning them to the owner, is not considered reselling the Dmai, and the buyer is not responsible to take off Meiser. Mishnah Gimel. Hamaitzi Peris v'derech v'natan la'achlan. As we saw in the previous Mishnah, the kinyan is finalized when the transfer of ownership happens when the person who's buying the item performs a kinyan, which is the act of taking ownership with the kavana, with the das, to be kaina. The Mishnah is going to teach us how this applies to the chiyuv of meiser. So, hamaitzi peris v'derech v'natan la'achlan. If a person found produce on the road and took it to eat it, this is speaking of something that had no identifying mark, which would be a siman. Therefore, the person who found it is mutter to keep it for himself. The Mishnah is discussing produce that has reached the stage where meiser already takes effect. V'nimlach lahatzniya, then he changed his mind and decided not to keep it for himself, but instead put it in a sheltered spot on the side of the road to take. He placed it in a protected spot where it's out of the reach of birds and animals. I guess it's in some kind of kvechta corner where the animals won't be able to take it, or he hid it. Lo yatzniya ad sheya'aser, he may not put it in a sheltered spot until he takes meiser off of it. As soon as he lifted the produce with plans to eat it, it became his. But when he later decides and he changed his mind to leave the produce for others, he's discarding his own Dmai produce, he's being mafkir his thing. Since the status of the produce is not known, it's considered Dmai. Therefore, as we learned in the previous Mishnah, he must take off meiser from the produce first, and then he can put it in this safe hiding spot. But if he did not intend to acquire the produce, he originally took the produce to protect it, so it shouldn't be destroyed because he doesn't want this food to get lost and somebody could enjoy it. So he never meant to own it. So Pater is Pater from Meiser, since he did not mean to take the produce for himself when he picked it up, it never became his, and he has no chiyuv to take off Meiser before he throws it out. The Mishnah in the second parak taught us that it's mutter for a person to sell a large quantity of Dmai, but not a small quantity. So the Mishnah now applies that law to a matana. Kol davar she'en adam rasha l'mocher Dmai le'yishlach le'chaveri Dmai. Whatever a person is not permitted to sell if it's Dmai, for example, a small quantity of Dmai which a person is not allowed to sell without taking off Meiser, le'yishlach le'chaveri Dmai, may not send as a gift to his friend if it is Dmai. Dmai may not be given as a gift, even if the giver tells the one that's being mekabel the matana that the produce is Dmai, because we're concerned that the giver may forget to inform the one who's receiving the gift, and the recipient may then eat it without taking off meiser. So, Rabbi Yossi matir bevadai u'levad sheyedienu. So, according to the opinion that the Mishnah just mentioned, it's also usher to give tevel as a gift. But the Mishnah is chaylik in terms of tevel. Rabbi Yossi matir bevadai u'levad sheyedienu. Rabbi Yossi permits sending even a small amount of tevel as a gift, as long as he lets the person who is receiving the gift know that no meiser was taken from the produce. Rabbi Yossi is not concerned that the giver might forget to let the recipient know. Rabbi Yossi is matir giving tevel as a gift. He agrees that one may not sell tevel, even if he lets the buyer know that no meiser or truma was taken off. However, regarding a matana, where the one giving does not get any profit, so the chachamim were makel and allowed even giving a small amount. However, Rabbi Yossi agrees with Tanakama that a person may not give a small amount of Dmai as a gift, even if he tells the person receiving the gift that the produce is tevel and no meiser was taken off. Even vadai. Since the Isra of Dmai is not as chomor as the Isra of tevel, so even Rabbi Yossi is concerned that the giver will neglect to tell the recipient that he must take meiser off the produce. Mishnah Talit. The rest of the parak is going to be dealing with produce that was already gemaisert, that was ready to process or to watch, to a person who's not trusted regarding meiser and shvius. Shvius obviously is the shemitah and has many halachas and restrictions regarding of how and when it may be used. And even though mostly it may be a deraisa, but Amei Aretz are suspect of not observing the hilchos shvius properly. So Hamelech chitim l'teichen kusi or l'teichen Amei Aretz. Someone who brings food that meiser was already taken off, and it was not a problem with shvius, to a kusi miller or to a miller who's an Amei Aretz for him to grind into flour. So what's a kusi? Is just a brief overview of kusim. After the galus of the 10 Shvatim by the king of Ashur, so the non-Jewish residents of Kusa and certain areas were brought in by the people who conquered that area to live in that land where the Jews were chased out of. Because of an outbreak of lion attacks, they converted to Yiddishkeit. However, they did not keep the mitzvahs properly. Therefore, we must suspect that the produce is either Dmai or of Shmita. The Machlekes, whether they were, is Machlekes Tanoim, if the conversion to Yiddishkeit were Gerei Emes or they were Gerei Arai. So they true Gerim and they converted to Judaism with sincerity, or they converted just based on the fact that they were getting eaten by lions. Later, however, it was discovered that they were continuing their idolatrous ways, and they were therefore considered to be regular Ovdei Avodah Zarah, and we'll see as we go on more about this. So, if a person brings chitim that Meiser was already taken off of, either to a kusi or to a miller who's an Amma Oretz, it remains in its original status regarding Meisus and Shvius, and that would mean that the flour that the miller returns to the owner is presumed to have been made with the Gemeiser, not Shvius, wheat that he gave the miller. Even though Kusim and Amei Ha'aretz are not trusted regarding Meisus and Shvius, we're not concerned that the miller exchanged the customer's wheat with his own wheat, or with wheat that another customer who's also not trusted regarding Meisus and Shvius gave him to grind. This is because Kusim and Amei Ha'aretz are not suspected to take something that's not their own. Therefore, they are careful that each customer should receive the flour ground from his own grain. But if the miller is a goy, so then Dmai, the flour he receives in turn is Dmai, because we are concerned that the flour was made from wheat which an Amma Oretz gave the goy to grind. Since the goy at times may take something that's not his, they're not careful about Gineva or Gisela, so we're concerned that the miller might not have been careful to make sure that each customer receives the flour flour ground from the wheat that he brought. It is therefore possible that the customer's wheat was exchanged with the wheat of another customer who's an Amma Oretz. And the possibility that the goy may have used his own wheat to make the flour does not present a concern, since the wheat of a goy is patur from Meiser altogether. Hamafkid peirosav etzel akusia etzel Amma Oretz. If someone leaves his peiros for safekeeping with the kusi with the Amma Oretz, but again, it's becheskos on the Meiser shel Shvius. It remains in its original status regarding Meisus and Shvius, and that is, we're not concerned that the kusi of the Amma Oretz, which the produce which he was given with the other produce, since, as we mentioned before, they're not suspected to take something that's not theirs. So when the produce is returned to the owner, he does not need to be concerned that it is tevel or it's from Peiros Shvius. But by Eitzel Oved Kechavim, Kiperoisov, if he leaves the food that was meisered already for safekeeping with a goy, the produce that the goy gave back to him has the same status as the goy's produce, which is not subject to the laws of Meisus and Shvius. Produce that was grown by a non-Jew and owned by him, when the chiyuv of Meiser happens, when it's fully processed, is part from Trumas and Meisus. For all practical purposes, then, the ruling of this case is identical to the ruling in the previous case, where it was left to the Kusir Amma Oretz. In both cases, Meiser is not required. The only difference is why it's not required. In the previous case, Meiser is not required, since we can assume that the miller is returning the same produce that was given to him for safekeeping. While here, it's not required, even if it was exchanged, the produce was grown by a goy and is therefore patur from Trumas and Meisers. Although goyim are suspected to take something that's not theirs, there's no concern here that the returned produce may have belonged to an Amma Oretz, which is Dmai, since unlike a miller, there's no reason to assume that this guy has other people's produce in his possession. Therefore, the only possible concern is that he may have exchanged the Jew's produce with his own produce, which is not an issue, since the produce of a guy is not mechuyev in Meiser or Shvius. Reb Shimon argues, and he says, Dmai, the produce he receives from a guy is Dmai, because the guy may taka have exchanged it with the produce given to him for safekeeping by an Amma Oretz. Reb Shimon argues that just as this Yid gave the guy produce to watch, so to another Yid who may be an Amma Oretz may have done the same. Therefore, we must be concerned that the guy exchanged the Meiser for the Dmai. And it's lav dafka that he did it on purpose, but because this may have happened, Reb Shimon says it's worthwhile being extra careful and taking off Dmai here as well. Mishnah Hey. Hanaisin Lapundokis. Someone, a chaver, who's trusted regarding Meiser, gave raw food to a woman innkeeper who is an Am Ha'aretz to cook for him. So in the times of the Mishnah, it was common for people who would be staying in an inn to bring their own raw food, which then they would have the innkeeper cook for them. And the Mishnah is going to discuss what to do when the innkeeper is an Am Ha'aretz. So Hanaisin Lapundokis, someone gives it to a woman innkeeper, he must take off Meiser which from the food that he gives her, and from the food which she gives back to him after she already cooked it. She's suspected to exchange the food with her own. Therefore, the real food that is given to her, Ma'aser must be taken off from, since there is concern that she may take it and eat it without taking off Ma'aser. As a rule, a chaver is careful not to allow any un-Ma'aser food to leave his possession. When there is concern that it may be eaten without taking off Ma'aser. So the cooked food that she returns to him must also be gemaiser, because that food may be her own food, which is the Dmai. Although we learned in the previous Mishnah that in general, Amei Haaretz are not suspected to exchange food, an innkeeper is an exception to this rule, because she justifies that it's permitted for her to exchange her better quality food for her guests' lower quality food. And the case that the Gemara in Gittin talks about is that, she sees a fine young budding scholar, and she'll say it's pasnish for him to eat such low quality food, she'll exchange it for a higher quality food, which is very interesting because she's an Amaris, but at the same time she's showing a little bit respect to the B'nai Torah. So she rationalizes that there's nothing wrong with what she's doing, since her intention is to benefit the chaver. This Mishnah must be speaking of when this happens a while after Shemitah, when there's no longer concern that the produce is Shemitah, is from Peir Shvius. During Shemitah and shortly afterwards, the guest must be concerned that the produce that was returned to him was from Shvius as well. Rabbi Yaisi disagrees, and he says, we're not responsible for swindlers. Since she's acting deceitfully, she's not being honest, and she's exchanging the food, we don't protect her from the effects of her action. Therefore, he's only mechuyev to take a meiser from that which he takes back from her, but not the raw food that he gives her, even though as a result of this, she may end up eating food that meiser wasn't taken off of. So, what's the machlekes here? So Rabbi Yaisi argues with the Tanakama, who holds that when the innkeeper exchanges the food, she has her guest's best interest in mind and exchanges it with better quality food. Well, according to Rabbi Yaisi, she switches the food with lower quality food for her own personal gain. Therefore, since she unlawfully switches it with her own interest in mind, the guest is not responsible if she eats his, meaning if she'll eat his unmeisered produce. Although Amei Haaretz are normally not suspected of Gneva, an innkeeper may rationalize that she's entitled to take his food that's better quality in exchange for her services. She's going to be some kind of meira heter to take it. Rabbi Yaisi agrees, however, that the guest must take meiser of the food that he receives from the innkeeper in order to protect himself from sin, even if he's not going to be achrei for the Rab Moed. Mishnah Vav. One who gives raw food to his mother-in-law to cook for him, and the mother-in-law is an Amei Haaretz. So he must take off meiser from what he gives her and what he takes back from her. The reason for this is because she's suspected of exchanging that which spoils. That is, if the food he gave her gets ruined while she's cooking it, his mother-in-law is likely to exchange his food with her own food without his knowledge. So then she'll give him the food to eat, and she'll eat his food. She'll switch it around. Therefore, in order to prevent any isurim over here, he must take off the meiser from the food that he gives her and that which he takes back from her. Now, normally, Amei Haaretz are not suspected of exchanging food entrusted to them, but the Tana explains why a mother-in-law is suspected of exchanging her son-in-law's food, because we suspect that she'll exchange her daughter-in-law's food, because number one, she desires the well-being of her daughter and doesn't want her to eat that food because it became ruined, and number two, she's embarrassed on account of her son-in-law to return him food that became ruined. Rabbi Yehuda is actually the author of the ruling, just cited in the Mishnah, is merely explaining the reasoning, he's not arguing. Right? Omer Rabbi Yehuda is different than Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Omer Rabbi Yehuda says Rabbi Yehuda as a continuation or as an explanation of what the Mishnah previously said. When Rabbi Yehuda Omer, that would be more of a difference of opinion. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, however, was not accepted by the other Tanoim. The Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and maintain that a mother-in-law will return to her son-in-law his food that became ruined. Accordingly, the Chachamim are not concerned that she will exchange his food with hers. Therefore, the son-in-law does not need to take off meiser from the food that he gives her, nor from the food that he takes back from her. The Mishnah is going to bring another case where Rabbi Yehuda agrees to the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the Chachamim in the case of someone who gives his mother-in-law non-shvius peiros that are not from shvius to be taken care of, to be cooked during shvius. Because even a non-shvius food that he gives her will get ruined. She's not suspected of changing with produce of shvius, and therefore feeding her daughter produce of shvius. Although Rabbi Yehuda is concerned that the mother-in-law might replace her son-in-law's food with peiros that are not mesukanim, he agrees that she would not replace it with shvius produce. Amei Haaretz consider the laws of shvius more serious than the laws of maishus, and the mother would not exchange her son-in-law's food with Shviya's produce, since it would cause the daughter to eat Shviya's produce, Shaloikidin. Although we learned in Mishnah Dalet that Amei Ha'aretz cannot be trusted with regard to Perish Shvius, nevertheless, Amei Ha'aretz are aware that it's the Chomer of the Isser. Therefore, the mother-in-law will not switch her observant daughter's food and cause her to transgress the laws of Shvius, even if it means that she'll need to serve her son-in-law and daughter food that became ruined. So then, the Chaver will not need to be concerned that his mother-in-law returns Shvius produce.